The dyslexia debate has erupted once again in Britain after a new book suggested the term dyslexia should be abandoned. In the 1970s, children with dyslexia were often labelled as thick or lazy, but in the last 30 years it has been recognised as a specific condition. But what does being dyslexic really mean? And as some media headlines suggest, has it just become a label used by some parents to excuse their child's poor reading ability? Taking part in this debate is Professor Julian Elliott, an educational psychologist, former special needs teacher and author of The Dyslexia Debate. Martha Gill, who blogs for The Telegraph and specialises in neuroscience and society. David Mills, independent television producer, who made a TV documentary called The Dyslexia Myth. And Alex Dyer, director of the Tutor House, a private tutoring company in London. And Dr John Rack, head of research development and policy at Dyslexia Action. So how should the dyslexia debate continue? Professor Elliott.
Well, what we're saying is that for many, many young people and adults, there is a severe difficulty encountered in decoding text. And this generally has a biological basis and can be complex and problematic to address. But here's where it gets problematic. When people see youngsters with these kinds of difficulties, well-meaning others will often say to mum and dad, you know what, your little Jimmy's having really great difficulty with his reading. Maybe he's dyslexic. Have you ever thought about getting him assessed? And so off go parents with Jimmy to get the assessment, and usually it will usually be found that they are dyslexic. But here's some problems. Firstly, as we show in the book quite clearly, the understanding of dyslexia varies substantially from one person to another. The prevalence rates range from 4%, some people say, and some people go all the way up to 20%. That's 5 times more. A whole range of different symptoms and processes and different problems are put into long lists. So firstly, then, we're arguing that this construct is extremely problematic. Secondly, if you get the dyslexia diagnosis, it tells you absolutely nothing at all that's additional to or different from the kinds of practices that skilled teachers already put into place with children with reading difficulties. Unlike going to doctor for diagnosis, where you get some kind of treatment, the dyslexia diagnosis doesn't offer you anything additional. Thirdly, if there are benefits to getting a diagnosis of dyslexia, either some kind of resource accommodations or more sympathetic hearing, the problem with this is that only some youngsters get this diagnosis. Only some youngsters have parents who are able to perhaps get this and with the wherewithal and so on. And a whole range of children I've worked with myself, for example, and many other children in more difficult, disadvantaged areas are less likely to get the label and therefore less likely to get the resources and the kind of sympathy or help that's provided as a result. What we're arguing is we should dispense with all of this and intervene at the very earliest stage we can with a child as soon as they're showing difficulties at a very early age, and all kids with these problems, not some kind of subgroup that we call dyslexic.
And when you say it's with parents that have the wherewithal to help, that probably is where the media headlines pick up upon it being a middle-class problem.
Absolutely. I mean, any parent, of course, parents quite understandably, again, to do all they can do to get their kids help and get their support and so on. The trouble is that only the parents of only some children are in a position to do this or have the ability to do this, and many, many other youngsters are not going to get this kind of support or help. So what we're recommending is a much better, more equitable, more fair way of operating at a much early age and for all kids, not just some kids. And if you intervene at an early stage, what research has demonstrated is that the problems are less likely to emerge later on in life. So instead of waiting for a child to fail and then sending them off for a diagnosis of some kind, and only some of them getting that, rather than doing that, we're saying intervene at the beginning, put all our resources, all the help we can into this early stage and try and stop it at that point.
What is reading disability? And you're saying that the effort should go into tackling that reading ability early on, as opposed to waiting retrospectively and then subsequently diagnosing a dyslexia.
Absolutely. I mean, we've shown in the book that we've reviewed the literature, and we have demonstrated that you can identify at a young age kids who are either at risk of reading failure at some point in the future or are actually currently having difficulties of this kind. You don't need a whole bunch of complex tests, and some schools do things where they get kids threading beads on string and all these kind of things. All you really need to do is look closely at the youngsters' skills, the academic skills themselves, and address those directly and as early as you possibly can.
David Mills first, then Martha.
I mean, when I made the Channel 4 documentary on reading disability, we filmed extensively and followed extensively the Cumbrian intervention, which was applied by teaching assistants in Cumbrian schools to young children with a reading disability. And it was extremely well researched by academics at York University. The American academics we spoke to said it was one of the best studies they had encountered. And within 12 weeks in these Cumbrian schools, they were able to move the reading age of the children forward by between 8 and 9 months, which is significantly faster than many traditional dyslexic interventions. And it showed that by tackling the problem early, identifying the children early, by concentrating on the phonological deficit in these children at a very early age and in a fairly intensive way, but quite cheaply, you can move things on very considerably for these children. And the little girl that we focused on in the programme, I think she was 7 or 8, had a huge reading difficulty. She was just being introduced to the Cumbrian intervention in Scarborough, in a school which had taken it over, and within about 6 months of the programme going out, her mother rang me and said that her reading had been so transformed by this simple, inexpensive intervention that she was now reading voraciously. I mean, that is the right approach. There's little interest in putting that very simple training programme into wider use. The dyslexia lobby is so full of more complex, more expensive interventions. Reading recovery is more expensive, but there are simple interventions which, applied early on and in a very disciplined way, can transform the lives of these children at relatively inexpensive. And all the concentration on dyslexic children later on, I think, is taking our eye off what could be done for these children much earlier on.
Martha, you wanted to respond to Professor Elliott. Do you think that the labelling system of dyslexia is too wide and we've lost sight of what perhaps could be achieved in an early intervention fashion that David just suggested?
I think perhaps the label is a bit wide, but I don't think that that's necessarily reason to do away with it altogether. I think that Julian Elliott puts forward a couple of reasons for getting rid of it, which I wouldn't necessarily agree with. One of them being that, you know, the kind of treatments for dyslexia are only available to some people. I mean, I think that that's a reason for investment in these areas which are more deprived rather than necessarily getting rid of it. I think that the fact that perhaps children respond better when there's an earlier intervention isn't necessarily a reason for getting rid of dyslexia, but rather, you know, identifying it earlier on.
But what is dyslexia? That's the major problem. There are 28 different definitions. Which one are you going to use? There are
about 28 different definitions of schizophrenia, but people find it a very useful term. It's a cluster concept. There are lots of various different diseases within it, but people understand what it means, so therefore they're able to treat them. I mean, I think that...
The question is, if you diagnose dyslexia the way you say later on, what would you do differently to what you would be doing already once you've identified the youngsters earlier on as having these kinds of problems?
I think what's helpful about, all we're talking about really here is semantics, I guess, because, you know, if you say, you know, if we do an evidence-based research which shows that children struggling particularly with literacy problems are helped with certain areas. I mean, the only difference we're talking about is whether or not we call it dyslexia. I think dyslexia is a helpful term merely because it's without stigma at the moment. As you say, parents are very eager to have their children diagnosed as dyslexic. It's one of those rare terms for a I suppose it's a neurological disorder, which parents are happy to have their kids diagnosed with, and which is not confused with being stupid or slow.
So we have
there are a group of intelligent kids who struggle with this particular thing, and I think why not call them dyslexia?
Dr. John Rack is...
Yes, can I just cut back on that one if I may?
Very briefly, and then because I'd like to hear from Dr. Rack.
The trouble is that you've already said that there are multiple understandings, and then you talk about semantics. So we're trying to deal with a science here, so we need to be very, very clear the terms we use. But the point is that it tells you nothing about what to do. The Select Committee of Education constantly challenged the dyslexia lobby when they took evidence at their report in 2009 to say what was different for a dyslexic kid than for any other youngster with reading difficulties, and they constantly asked and didn't get an answer. And if you read the report, you'll see the frustration they had as a result.
Well, I think... Sorry, can I just come back in?
Come in there, yes.
Yeah, Dr. Rack.
I think we are talking about... we have a lot of agreement here, that's the first thing to say. As part of the dyslexia lobby, and I have to put my cards on the table and say, I've been involved in assessing children and adults with dyslexia for many years, and that's what Dyslexia Action primarily does. We assess, we teach, and we train. So you could say we have a vested interest. But we and the rest of the lobby also strongly advocate early intervention. And the point about definitions, I think, is somewhat of a red herring, as has been pointed out. There's always variability in any construct, and there's always grey areas around the edge. But in 2009, a significant year, the Rose Review that reported to the Department for Education agreed a definition that placed the phonological difficulties with decoding and some things in memory and speed of processing at the core, and it said this is what dyslexia is, let's agree on that, and let's recognise that there can be other things that go along with it, so-called co-occurring difficulties, which complicate the picture. Now, of course, and when I was part of that advisory group, and we considered the issue of screening, but we rejected that and said, no, in the early stages, you don't need to screen to differentiate. Quite agree with Joe Elliott here. You teach in a structured, systematic way, and you do that, never mind whether you've got a dyslexia issue or whether you think it's a poor reading issue. The issues are similar, but dyslexia goes beyond that. And as David Mills has said, the reading intervention program done in Cumbria, very good, and many evidence-based practices that show that this sort of approach works. But there always remains some for whom it doesn't work so well. And then there are ongoing problems later on in schooling to do with spelling, to do with organisation, often to do with fluency in reading. And let's forget also a subgroup of people who actually decode fairly well, but struggle with comprehension. So there's variety, and there are different shades of dyslexia for sure, and there are different factors that come into play for different people. And very often it's useful to understand what those are with an assessment. I wouldn't want it early on. I wouldn't want it to be a gate to prevent anyone receiving support. Completely agree on that. But I do think when someone has struggled and school has been confusing and learning has been confusing to them, if you can have something that points to where specific problems are and points to strategies that you can use, because we know lots of things that work, and we can say, look, other people who've had these similar sorts of difficulties find these things helpful, then that's of value. And I really do have to take issue with Joe on the issue, on the question that you do exactly the same. So I don't think you actually mean that, Joe. I think what you mean is that you do what different people need, which is variable.
I meant that. Yeah, thanks, John. If I can clarify, what I mean is you do the same thing in responding to individual differences of kids that you would do whether they had the label of dyslexia or not. And of course, what we put in the book in our final conclusion is the importance of differentiating between reading accuracy, reading fluency, reading comprehension, speech and language, handwriting, spelling, written expression, and so on. And we're arguing that you have got to assess each of these things independently and then put in place the best evidence-based interventions you possibly can. The other thing I'd say to John is that, of course, when you talk about phonological awareness and the sorts of things that were in Rose, it didn't actually mention things like the coloured lenses, where there's a huge industry for coloured lenses and overlays as a treatment of dyslexia, which doesn't seem to fit in with the kind of definition you've just outlined. And I think that this...
No, and there's a reason for that, and the reason is we didn't accept that there was evidence to suggest that colour lenses and filters were something that caused a specific benefit for people with dyslexia. Yeah. For some people who have eye strain and find visual disturbances in certain kinds of lighting conditions, it may help. But no, Rose was very clear, and we spent lots of time discussing this, because as you say, there is a lobby to say this is what we should all be doing, and it wasn't. We did not make that recommendation.
Hold on a second, guys. Sorry, we haven't heard from one of our guests yet, and just not to make sure we're all inclusive here. We talked a lot about the term and the phrase, and a lot of what you have mentioned means, we're still going back to the core that actually what is a reading disability, and you mentioned in the conclusion of your book, Professor Elliott, that there's reading fluidity, all sorts of different phrases relating to not necessarily dyslexia, but the reading disability that children suffer. Now, Alex Dyer, you are a director of Tutor House and you offer a private tutoring service.
That's correct, yeah.
What age do you work with?
Well, I think this is a question for everyone, really. I mean, our problem really that we encounter is not necessarily that, we have a number of educational psychologists that we work with closely in school, out of school. But the main problem that we have is, and everyone keeps saying, what is dyslexia? How do we define it? But our main problem is intervention, as in, how do we intervene? Not when, because we're saying that younger and younger and younger is the best option. But how to intervene? What sort of people should intervene? What sort of techniques should they use to intervene? And how should it go about? So I guess it's more of from our angle, we have schools, we have parents, we have educational psychologists that contact us looking for specifically trained people to work with them and help their children and bring them up to speed with what they need to achieve at school at certain levels. Quite often that's I guess we would call older children, 15, 16. From my angle, that is far too late to really, not necessarily help, but it's hard to intervene, as people say. But I guess this is for you really, Professor. What is the best way to intervene on this? As in, who should be doing the intervening? How should it work? What would you suggest on that?
Yeah, I mean, I've written about 20,000 words on intervention in the book. It's really difficult to summarize it up in this.
That's fair
but
enough, yeah.
Basically, we're talking about good, almost traditional kinds of approaches to structured phonics and sound, but embedded within approaches which take on the whole area of kind of literacy and story and the meaning and so on. It's there's a huge literature that's been done in the United States. Much of it's coming out of the University of Texas, and where they've been trying to find ways to deal with what is sometimes called treatment resistors. That's these youngsters who are and older people who, whatever you do with the best forms that we have, seem to be not making progress. And it's quite sad to say that even the highest quality research coming out of the top outfits in the United States are struggling to find ways to help the youngsters with the very, very complex problems. My suspicion, the kind of thing they're recommending is more intense interventions, more individualization, more structure. But that's really, in a sense, almost a kind of plea for don't know what else to do line. My view is there may be some youngsters for whom we really do need to use technology more and more to enable them to access speech chips, voice recognition, dictaphones, and so on and so forth of that kind of technology.
Yeah.
Do you say then that, Professor Elliott, that is that shouldn't be labelled as necessarily dyslexia? That's a different...
Absolutely, yeah, because some people say, I'm dyslexic, but I actually read fine. I've got other problems. And one of the things that happens is people send me lots and lots of case studies of dyslexic individuals, and if you take the full range of cognitive processes that people might have, and things such as attention, concentration, working memory, processing speed, organization, all these kinds of things, ability to analyze, synthesize, and so on, what you find is people take one or two of those processes and say, I'm dyslexic and I've got this problem. But the trouble is you're getting across the full range of cognitive processing. And then you took on top of that all the visual attention problems, which since Rose reported, there's been a lot of work done in the last 2 or 3 years showing massive difficulties for a small proportion of children. It's nothing to do with language whatsoever for those kids. It's to do with being able to attend visually to text. And there's some very exciting new work coming out on that, where there's absolutely no implications for practice on the back of that, because no one's been able to work out what on earth we're going to do about it. Intervention is complicated, yes. And it is a real problem for a significant proportion of youngsters who just don't seem to make progress, whatever we do with the best approaches that we know of.
David
When I made the documentary, what I was being told by leading academics both in Britain and in the United States was that children who have continuing problems with reading have multiple problems. They may have poor short-term memory. They may be clumsy. They're rather unfortunate individuals who have a whole wide range of problems. And each of those children, the collection of problems that they have will be different, and they will need a different approach. And so it doesn't make much sense to describe them all as dyslexic. I mean, if you take the most common, the common second disability associated with reading disability, it is probably poor short-term memory. But if you actually look at people who have a reading disability, only 36% at most have poor short-term memory. And in one major US study, they took 60 children with profound reading disability, and they found only eight had very poor short-term memory, and 7 had very good short-term memory, so that there isn't a syndrome that you can point to which simplifies the treatment package that you have to be provided. And I think dyslexia gives the impression that there's a dyslexic intervention that you can do, whereas all these children have to be seen as differently. The early reading intervention picked up, dealt with, and where children still have problems because of these multiple weaknesses which they've grown up with, then they have to be treated individually, because it doesn't make sense to lump them together.
Would you agree, Martha, that it doesn't make sense to lump all these deficiencies together and do away with the term dyslexia?
Well, what I would say is that in the research field, in the research that's being done on dyslexia, I mean, of which there's sort of 5 decades of hinterland, and it's moving forward, that the type of research that's being done is moving forward very carefully in these different, which they've sort of delineated, fields of dyslexia. Some of it's associated with eye movement. You can tell, according to them, an optometrist, if you look at the way that a child's eyes move over text, you can tell whether or not they're dyslexic, or indeed, whatever you want to call it, by the way that their eyes move, because it's a difficulty in decoding, and the eye movement will be different. There's a whole wealth of research in this which is specifically going towards identifying that bracket of children who are just intelligent, who are, might be very bright, but have specific problems in literacy. They may be very good at maths or whatever, and wanting to define them as dyslexic against people who simply have reading difficulties. Now, there are many ways you can do this. There's anatomical differences. It's been recorded in dyslexics. There are differences which you can pick up with electrophysiology, and if you look in their eyes I don't know whether Julia and Elliott will rubbish these studies, but they are being done, and it seems to me that there's progress. Now, I don't know if you just sort of ditch the term altogether because we're not quite there. That seems to me, a species of giving up. My opinion is that we should keep the term because it's a useful bracket in which all this research is being done, but merely make it slightly more specified. All the problems that you seem to bring up are just people's interpretations of the word dyslexia, and things that people might think about dyslexic children, or things that have been done before which aren't quite right. I think that we should keep the term, but merely improve our methods and improve our education about what dyslexia actually means.
Who was that? Dr. Rack there?
Yes, it was me. Yes,
Dr. Rack. Dr. John Rack.
I agree in many ways with the last point there, that the term has some value, and it needs to be improved. But I think, just going back to the question about what you do for people who struggle. Now, we've had a wonderful agreement here that there are a group of children who don't respond to the kind of teaching that might be called best practice, and that what one has to do is try different things with them, a very individualized approach. That's exactly what Dyslexia Action does, and that's indeed a core feature of what quotes unquote dyslexia teaching is. It's highly individualized, and it's about finding a combination of methods that work both to strengthen the skills that are there, find compensatory ways around other ways of doing things, and making connections to avoid some of the problematic areas. So that sort of approach is what dyslexia specialist teaching is. It's highly individualized, and it's using the individual's own strengths to build on what they can do, but also to teach some of the things that many children figure out for themselves. We infer a lot of the rules about how reading and language works, but children who struggle with this need to have that made very explicit. So they need often concrete ways of showing how words break down. They need to focus often on word units of meaning, so-called morphological units. And often they remember things better if they do them rather than just simply listening and speaking all the time. So that sort of multisensory approach is a key part.
Dr. Rack, sorry, just to interrupt you there, I just wanted to ask again, can't we just keep the term dyslexia as an umbrella, but sort of subdivide it into different categories? Again, going back to my point about intervention, that is what we really care about at the end of the day. We actually want to intervene and help children from a young age so they can progress through life and have the opportunity that other people should have. That's how I see it. So is it not, can we not, subcategorize dyslexia into, a number of different areas? That would make the intervention easier.
We can, yeah. We absolutely can, and we need to do more large-scale or sample studies to say, okay, of all the people that we look at, how many show features of co-occurring difficulties in attention and concentration? I mean, we can kind of complain that some do and some don't, and therefore that undermines the construct. I say it doesn't undermine the construct. The core is there. And we agree about what it is. And what we say that there are these different things that some people have, co-occurring problems, that complicate the way you teach and make it harder for those people to respond to teaching. So let's understand those too. And let's also understand that some people have those sorts of complicating difficulties in, say, coordination and attention that don't involve problems in reading. So let's call that something else. We're talking about different ways of dividing the pie, if you like, or dividing the space in which people differ. And they differ, they differ in many, many ways. I think it's useful to have these clusters. Admittedly, they're imprecise in that, the edges are blurred, but they make a lot of sense to people when you explain this is what the tests show, this is how we understand and explain the kinds of problems you describe. Are the people who have similar things that recognize themselves in that. It gives meaning to struggles that people have had, and it points them in the direction of useful strategies that they can put in place. So I think it is of value. I'd rather ditch the term ordinary poor reading, because I actually don't think there is anything such thing as ordinary poor reading. So let's ditch that.
David Mills.
Yes, I think what we're forgetting here is that if the general population identified dyslexia as you are just defined it, that might be perfectly acceptable, but they don't. And dyslexics don't either. It's become an enormously charged emotional term. After I made the documentary, I could not believe the ferocity with which I was being attacked, because I had suggested that that people with dyslexia had multiple problems. What most people want to believe when they think about dyslexia is that somehow there are dim-witted poor readers, and then there are dyslexics who are very bright, but have some sort of little... But that's not the way it is. The more problems you have as an individual, the dimmer you are. That's the fierce reality of it. And instead of accepting that and trying to identify, dyslexia becomes a bit of a crutch, and I think all this moves us into huge waste of money. Individuals who are defined as dyslexic can get, it may have changed under the present, but when I made the documentary, I discovered to my horror that they could get up to about £9,000 on tape recorders and all sorts of things which had never been proved, and that overall it's impossible to find it was impossible at the time to find just how much the government was spending, but maybe as much as £50 million was being spent on children who were defined as dyslexia on ways that all the academics were saying to me was largely a waste of time and effort. And money.
Well, there's always going to be some of that. I think we can't avoid that. But this issue of a crutch, I think, is it's disingenuous. People need some support to make sense out of the struggles that they have.
Oh, absolutely.
And, even with particularly with the current government that we have, where if you don't speak properly, you don't spell properly, and your grammar isn't very good, you're marked down, and not so very long ago, if you spelt badly or you read badly, or even if you talked in a funny way, you were judged as being dim. So dyslexia has this history, and it serves a valuable purpose now in being a way that people can say, look, this is the problem that I have, but it doesn't mean that I've got all these other problems. I'm not necessarily dim. I'm not necessarily lazy. You might be lazy and dyslexic as well. Let's not say these things are exclusive. But it's a way that helps people make sense, and it's a positive way in which we can understand and recognize and give support to people who need it.
But the nonsense that comes from this definition of dyslexia is that I came across one lad who had poor reading, poor memory, several other problems, but because he had managed to get a diagnosis as being dyslexic, he was actually insisting on reading medicine. Medicine where you need a profoundly good memory and all the other literacy skills. And he was reading medicine on the basis that he was dyslexic and therefore was bright and had a duty to be able to read medicine. That was just nonsensical, and that's the sort of problems that we've run into with this very loose and not very useful definition of dyslexia. If it was redefined in the way you're suggesting, then I would be perfectly happy with it. But the reality is it's not going to be, and people who have this definition of dyslexia are not going to allow it to be redefined in that way. And so that it's better that we try to move on to a more rational position in Britain on these very profound problems.
We are
I
actually...
think the issue of intelligence, if I may say a bit, this is a really, really emotive issue, and I've spent quite a lot of time writing about that in the book, because as Martha said earlier, her understanding of dyslexia is that this is for high ability, high IQ kids who are poor readers, and this what's called a discrepancy model, which is the difference between IQ and reading ability, is still widely employed, even by psychologists who should know a lot better, despite the fact that it's been scientifically discredited as any way of diagnosing. And if you go to the British Dyslexia Association webpage, or you can actually ask John, because he'll say the same thing, people who both in the BDA and probably Dyslexia Action will say that dyslexia, as they understand it, operates across the full intellectual range. In other words, the whole idea about intelligence is irrelevant when you are talking about these kinds of complex reading problems of this kind. But because people think it is a way of saying, that the youngster is bright, but with a reading problem, that this is somehow stuck in people's consciousness and still used by some diagnosticians. And unfortunately, this is wrong. And even people who totally disagree with me from the dyslexia camp will, I'm sure, agree that I'm right.
I just wanted to come back to the last two things that were said very briefly. What you seem to be suggesting is that we do away with the term dyslexia. We're left so that, as you sort of rather extraordinarily suggested, that people who are sort of stupid dare to aspire to be doctors or whatever. I mean, there are very bright people with dyslexia who reach very high areas and they do extremely well. I don't think we should be dampening down people's aspirations. What you're suggesting doing with dyslexia, what are we left with? A bunch of sort of complex reading difficulties that people don't have any idea what they mean. And we're going to have to sort of install a whole range of education so that people do know what they mean and they know how to deal with them, they know how to respond to these people when they're going to interviews and all the rest of it. We've already got a lot of education out there about dyslexia. People know roughly what it means. It's not quite perfect, as you suggest, but at least it's not negative and discriminatory against these people. And I think we should seek to redefine, sort of narrow down a little bit, make it a little bit more of a useful term than do away with it altogether.
So redefine and recategorise and not necessarily ignore. Is anyone else would like to have a final word before I...
If I could just say one thing. The idea of excuse is, we put in these pejorative words. I don't think the word excuse should be used in this kind of conversation. It's not about people trying to excuse anything. It's quite understandable that parents of children who have suffered a lot of hurt and humiliation find that really, really want to try and find some explanation which will bat that away. And there's certain humiliation about things which are totally untrue. Often, kids, the idea that a child's lazy because they struggle to learn to read, or they're not very bright, and these things are wrong. We've got to address those problems at source. Stop it now. And make sure that no child is seen as lazy or inappropriately seen as low in intellectual ability. We must address that and make sure we knock that out.
There's no way to do that. A kid that does worse at school is always going to be...
Rather than having a diagnosis of dyslexia, which some parents will see this as a way of batting that away, but unfortunately there are many, many children out there who will not get their diagnosis and who may actually, as a result of this way of looking at the world, may actually be more likely to be seen as lazy, stupid, and all the other inappropriate epithets as a result of this.
But there is a fierce reality here that whilst early reading disability has nothing to do with IQ. It's a little bit like being colourblind or a little bit like being tone deaf. It has nothing to do with IQ. If it isn't corrected early, If it's allied to other neurological defects which undermine reading, if a child ends up not reading and doing much less reading than their peers, they will progressively become relatively less intelligent. I mean, that's the reading builds up intellect. If you don't read, your intellect is stifled, it's being held back. So that there is this awful problem that children with these many multiple problems, there is an intellectual result from what happens to these children, even though it starts without any intellectual relationship. Highly intelligent young children can suffer reading disability. But if they haven't started reading, and there's some marvellous research in the States which sets this out from Stanovich, if they haven't started reading, if they don't read, if they read far, far less than most other children, their intellect will suffer.
We clearly agree that this group of children exist, and we clearly agree that more needs to be done. I think dyslexia is useful. It's not a meal ticket. It does get you some resources at certain stages, but schools these days, they're good at recognizing kids with literacy difficulties, and they understand dyslexia. It's not a battleground anymore. So we don't have to, it doesn't need to be as emotionally charged as it is. So if you think you've got an issue with dyslexia, talk to your teacher at school. You may not need a diagnosis, but there is a lot that can be done that comes from a huge experience of what works for people who have been described in this way in the past.
That was Dr. John Reck, Head of Research Development and Policy at Dyslexia Action. I'd like to thank all my guests, Professor Julian Elliott, educational psychologist, former special needs teacher and author of The Dyslexia Debate, Martha Gill, who blogs for The Telegraph and specialises in neuroscience and society, Alex Dyer, director of Tutor House, a private tutoring company in London, and David Mills, an independent television producer who produced a TV documentary called The Dyslexia Myth, Head of Research Development and Policy at Dyslexia Action. So how should the dyslexia debate continue? Professor Elliott.
Well, what we're saying is that for many, many young people and adults, there is a severe difficulty encountered in decoding text. And this generally has a biological basis and can be complex and problematic to address. But here's where it gets problematic. When people see youngsters with these kinds of difficulties, well-meaning others will often say to mum and dad, you know what, your little Jimmy's having really great difficulty with his reading. Maybe he's dyslexic. Have you ever thought about getting him assessed? And so off go parents with Jimmy to get the assessment, and usually it will usually be found that they are dyslexic. But here's some problems. Firstly, as we show in the book quite clearly,
the dyslexia debate has erupted once again in Britain after a new book suggested the term dyslexia should be abandoned. In the 1970s, children with dyslexia were often labelled as thick or lazy, but in the last 30 years it has been recognised as a specific condition. But what does being dyslexic really mean? And as some media headlines suggest, has it just become a label used by some parents to excuse their child's poor reading ability? Taking part in this debate is Professor Julian Elliott, an educational psychologist, former special needs teacher and author of The Dyslexia Debate. Martha Gill, who blogs for The Telegraph and specialises in neuroscience and society. David Mills, independent television producer, who made a TV documentary called The Dyslexia Myth. And Alex Dyer, director of the Tutor House, a private tutoring company in London. And Dr. John Reck.
The understanding of dyslexia varies substantially from one person to another. The prevalence rates range from 4%, some people say, and some people go all the way up to 20%. That's 5 times more. A whole range of different symptoms and processes and different problems are put into long lists. So firstly, then, we're arguing that this construct is extremely problematic. Secondly, if you get the dyslexia diagnosis, it tells you absolutely nothing at all that's additional to or different from the kinds of practices that skilled teachers already put into place with children with reading difficulties. Unlike going to doctor for diagnosis where you get some kind of treatment, the dyslexia diagnosis doesn't offer you anything additional. Thirdly, if there are benefits to getting a diagnosis of dyslexia, either some kind of resource accommodations or more sympathetic hearing, the problem with this is that only some youngsters get this diagnosis. Only some youngsters have parents who are able to perhaps get this and with the wherewithal and so on. And a whole range of children I've worked with myself, for example, and many other children in more difficult, disadvantaged areas are less likely to get the label and therefore less likely to get the resources and the kind of sympathy or help that's provided as a result. What we're arguing is we should dispense with all of this and intervene at the very earliest stage we can with a child as soon as they're showing difficulties at a very early age, and all kids with these problems, not some kind of subgroup that we call dyslexic.
And when you say it's with parents that have the wherewithal to help, that probably is where the media headlines pick up upon it being a middle-class problem.
Absolutely. I mean, any parent, of course, parents quite understandably, again, to do all they can do to get their kids help and get their support and so on. The trouble is that only the parents of only some children are in a position to do this or have the ability to do this, and many, many other youngsters are not going to get this kind of support or help. So what we're recommending is a much better, more equitable, more fair way of operating at a much early age and for all kids, not just some kids. And if you intervene at an early stage, what research has demonstrated is that the problems are less likely to emerge later on in life. So instead of waiting for a child to fail and then sending them off for a diagnosis of some kind, and only some of them getting that, rather than doing that, we're saying intervene at the beginning, put all our resources, all the help we can into this early stage and try and stop it at that point.
What is reading disability? And you're saying that the effort should go into tackling that reading ability early on as opposed to waiting retrospectively.